Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, where America's hidden past comes alive. Captured German officers stared in shock as a U.S. aircraft carrier towered before them. Like, share, and subscribe to never miss the history they tried to bury. Asterisk, the year was 1944. The war that had consumed the world for nearly 5 years was finally turning against Germany. In Europe, Allied forces had landed in Normandy. In the Atlantic, German U-boats, once feared as wolves of the sea, were being hunted down like prey. In the Pacific, America's industrial might was rising higher with every passing month, producing ships, planes, and weapons in numbers the Axis could not even dream of matching. It was in this climate that a group of German officers, Naval and Luftwaffe, alike found themselves prisoners of war in American hands. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were men who had once commanded machines of death across the seas and skies. Some had stood on the bridges of U-boats, peering through periscopes as they stalked Allied convoys. Others had walked the halls of Luftwaffe bases, overseeing raids meant to break Britain's spirit. They were hardened, proud, and deeply loyal to the Germany they believed they served. Yet now, their world had collapsed. Captured during failed missions, intercepted at sea, or pulled from wreckage, they were no longer masters of battle. They were prisoners. The journey across the ocean to America was, in itself, a humiliation. Packed under guard, the Germans were forced to endure the irony of traveling aboard Allied ships, the very kind they had once sworn to destroy. For days, they listened to the rumble of American engines, the footsteps of sailors on deck, and the constant reminders that they were no longer feared enemies, but defeated men being carried to the heart of their foe's power. Still, pride lingered in their hearts. Many of them clung to the belief that Germany would somehow endure, that Hitler's promised weapons, the so-called wonder weapons, might turn the tide. Others, quietly, already knew the truth. But whether defiant or resigned, all of them carried an unspoken arrogance. They had fought against the world's strongest powers, and in their eyes, America was still a nation of mechanics and shopkeepers. Yes, its soldiers fought bravely. Yes, its factories produced endlessly. But in their minds, true military tradition belonged to Europe, to Germany, to themselves. That illusion would not last when the ship carrying them finally approached the American coast. The prisoners expected prison camps, questioning, and perhaps even parades meant to humiliate them. Instead, their guards had another plan. They were marched down gangways under the sharp gaze of American rifles, boots clattering against steel, the salty wind biting at their faces. They squinted into the bright sunlight of an unfamiliar shore, their uniforms disheveled, their insignia stripped away. The air itself felt different, cleaner, freer, vast in a way Europe's war-scarred skies no longer did. The American base was alive with movement. Trucks rumbled past. Dock workers shouted orders. Sailors hurried along walkways, carrying equipment, ammunition, supplies, everything in endless flow. To the Germans, it was overwhelming. This was no shattered, desperate nation clawing for survival. This was a machine, immense and unstoppable, grinding forward with an energy they had never seen. Still, they tried to hold their dignity. Officers stood tall, their faces stern, refusing to let their captors see weakness. Pride was the last weapon they had left. But step by step, as the guards led them deeper into the docks, something stirred in the air, a shadow on the horizon that grew larger with every passing moment. At first, they thought it was a trick of distance, a silhouette rising against the skyline. Then the shape became clearer. Steel, massive and dark, stretching farther than their eyes could follow. Towers reached upward. A long, flat deck seemed to swallow the sea itself. It was not a battleship, not a cruiser, not anything they had seen before. The German officers exchanged glances, their confidence faltering. They whispered to one another in disbelief. The Americans were not taking them to prison. They were taking them to witness something meant to shatter whatever remained of their pride. That something was an aircraft carrier dot, but in this moment before the full reveal, before they stood in its shadow, they still did not fully grasp what it meant. To them, war at sea had always been battleships, U-boats, destroyers. The carrier was an experiment, a floating airfield that Germany had never truly mastered. And yet here, on the edge of an American dockyard, one of these giants waited. The guard said nothing. They did not boast. They did not mock their prisoners. They simply marched them forward. The Americans understood the power of silence. They knew that the sight itself would speak louder than any taunt. For the German officers, those final steps were the longest of their lives. The closer they came, the larger the shadow grew, until it swallowed them whole. The vastness of American industry, the force of a nation that had risen from depression into unmatched power, towered above them in steel and iron dot in that moment. Pride began to crack. The prisoners slowed as the shadow stretched across the pier. Their boots clicked against the wooden planks, the air heavy with salt and oil, the gulls crying overhead. But even the sounds of the harbor seemed to fade, swallowed by the immensity of what stood before them. The German officers lifted their eyes, and for the first time, they saw it. Before them loomed a U.S. aircraft carrier, a floating city of war. Its steel deck stretched out farther than their eyes could follow, a horizon of iron and rivets. The carrier's towering island, bristling with antennas and radar, stabbed upward into the sky. The flight deck, wide and endless, was lined with rows of sleek American fighters, Hellcats, and Avengers. Their wings folded tight like birds of prey waiting to strike. The Germans froze in place. One officer, a veteran of the Atlantic campaigns, whispered a single word under his breath. Unglaublich. Unbelievable. Another tightened his jaw, trying to mask the awe in his eyes. A third simply shook his head, silent, staring as though he had stepped into another world. They had known of these ships, of course. Reports had filtered back to Germany, stories of American carriers in the Pacific, striking the Japanese across vast distances. But to see one with their own eyes was something else entirely. No drawing, no intelligence report, no rumor could capture the scale of what now rose before them. The ship was alive. Crewmen hustled across the deck, preparing planes, checking engines, wheeling bombs on carts. The smell of fuel and grease filled the air. Engines roared as a fighter tested its power, the sound rattling in the Germans' chests like thunder. The deck vibrated under the weight of machines, and still the ship floated steady, unmoved, its bulk anchored in dominance that the Germans exchanged uneasy glances. They were men of war, proud of their own navy and Luftwaffe, but in their silence lay the truth. They had never seen anything like this. Germany had U-boats, yes, deadly predators of the deep. They had built battleships like Bismarck and Tirpitz, massive vessels bristling with guns. But they had never mastered the aircraft carrier. Their attempts had been few, scattered, unfinished. The Graf Zeppelin, left incomplete, an empty dream. Now, standing in the shadow of an American giant, the Germans realized just how far behind they were. The American guards said nothing. They simply stood back, rifles in hand, letting the sight of the carrier speak for itself. It was not arrogance. It was quiet confidence. The ship was proof enough of power. One of the Luftwaffe officers, his cap pulled low, finally spoke. His voice was tight, almost bitter. With one ship, they can bring an airfield anywhere. Anywhere in the world. Another nodded slowly. And they have more than one. The thought weighed heavy in their minds. This was not some rare jewel of war. The Americans had dozens of these carriers, each one a fortress of steel, carrying wings of death across oceans. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on naval innovation, were forced to admit the truth. They were staring at the future, and it did not belong to them. The narrator's voice lingers on this moment. Imagine the humiliation. These officers, once feared, had commanded men, machines, and missions meant to bring the world to its knees. Now they stood helpless, reduced to silent spectators as their enemy unveiled a weapon that changed the very nature of war. For America, the carrier was not just a ship. It was a statement. It meant that no corner of the globe was safe for the Axis. Planes launched from these decks could strike hundreds of miles away, beyond the horizon, delivering destruction with precision. No U-boat, no battleship, no fortress could escape their reach. The Germans felt it in their bones. Asterisk. One officer muttered something about Bismarck, once the pride of Germany, sunk in a furious battle. Another mentioned Tirpitz, trapped and hunted in the fjords of Norway, until she too was destroyed. Battleships had been their pride, but now, in the shadow of this carrier, battleships seemed like relics of a bygone age. The carrier represented something more terrifying than firepower. It represented industry. America's factories, churning day and night, could build these giants faster than Germany could sink them. Each rivet, each plane, each crewman was a symbol of an industrial machine the Nazis could never match. Asterisk. The Germans looked up again. The ship's flag fluttered in the wind, the stars and stripes, bold and proud. To them, it was no longer just a flag of their enemy. It was a banner of inevitability, the sign of a nation that had harnessed its strength and was now unstoppable. A silence settled over the prisoners. Pride still lingered, yes, but beneath it lay something deeper, an understanding. They had not simply lost a battle. They were losing the future. And yet, in that silence, there was also something else, a grudging respect. Even in their defeat, the Germans could not help but admire what they saw. The scale, the discipline, the sheer audacity of building such a machine, it demanded respect. Even from enemies. As the guards moved them along the pier, closer to the massive hull, the Germans craned their necks, their eyes following the lines of steel upward. The hull rose higher than a fortress wall, its gray paint streaked by salt and wind, its guns and defenses bristling along the sides. They could almost feel the hum of power coursing through its heart. The engines ready to carry this giant across oceans. Step by step, they were swallowed by its shadow. One German naval officer, once proud and defiant, finally lowered his eyes. The carrier was not just a ship, it was a reminder of what Germany could never achieve. In that moment, for the first time since their capture, defeat felt real. Asterisk. The Americans had no need for speeches. No guard barked out explanations. No officer recited statistics about the carrier's tonnage, speed, or the number of aircraft it could launch. None of that was necessary. The Germans could see it for themselves. That was the genius of it, the silence. The prisoners stood in the carrier's shadow, and the silence spoke louder than any words could. The ship was the message. Its sheer size, its endless deck, the aircraft gleaming in the sun, this was America saying, without saying a word, we own the seas. We own the skies. And soon we will own the war. The Germans shifted uncomfortably. Their boots scuffed the pier. Their eyes darted upward again and again, unable to take in the full scale. Pride kept their lips sealed, but inside, their thoughts raced. Every man there knew the truth. Germany had nothing like this. The Luftwaffe officers thought of their airfields back in Europe muddy, vulnerable, bombed daily by Allied raids. Here was an airfield that floated, mobile, immune to fixed bombing runs. If one base was destroyed, America could simply sail another into position. To a German officer who had watched his own bases shattered by bombs, the realization was crushing. For the naval officers, the humiliation cut even deeper. The Kriegsmarine had once dreamed of dominating the seas with mighty battleships like Bismarck and Tirpitz. But those dreams had sunk beneath the waves, destroyed by the Allies. Standing before the carrier, the German sailors understood something they had never wanted to admit. The era of the battleship was over. This was the new king of the oceans, and America had not built just one. The officers knew this too. Intelligence had reported dozens of carriers under construction, factories in places like Newport News and Brooklyn, pouring out steel giants one after another. The Americans were not content with a handful of these vessels. They intended to flood the seas with them. To the Germans, who struggled to produce a single large ship without delays and shortages, the scale of American industry was unimaginable. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The Germans did not dare ask questions, and the Americans did not offer answers. The prisoners could only stand there, humbled, absorbing what their eyes told them. One officer, his face pale, finally broke the silence with a muttered phrase in German. Das ist das Ende. This is the end. His words were not met with argument. None of his comrades contradicted him. They knew. The narrator's voice carries the weight of this moment. Here were men who had once believed they were part of a master race, soldiers of a regime that promised 1,000 years of dominance. And yet, within minutes of standing in the presence of an American carrier, that illusion crumbled. They were not conquerors. They were witnesses to their own defeat. The Americans allowed the silence to linger. To them, the carrier was not just a ship. It was a silent sermon. It told a story of factories running night and day, of millions of men and women back home working in unity, of a nation that had harnessed every ounce of its strength for victory. It told of planes that could rise into the sky and strike targets hundreds of miles away. It told of power so immense that no enemy could hope to match it. And it told the Germans something even more chilling. This was only the beginning. By 1944, America was launching carriers faster than Germany could build submarines. Each ship was stronger, larger, and deadlier than the last. If one was lost, another would soon take its place. The war had become a contest not just of weapons, but of will and industry. And in that contest, Germany had already lost. The Germans tried to mask their emotions, but it showed in their eyes, the flicker of fear, the weight of realization. Some clenched their fists, holding on to pride like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Others lowered their gaze, unwilling to meet the eyes of their captors. One of the guards, a young American sailor barely out of his teens, noticed the change. He said nothing, but inside he felt a quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to taunt the prisoners. The ship behind him had already done that. For the Germans, this moment was more than humiliation. It was revelation. They were not merely prisoners of war. They were witnesses to a new world being born, a world in which America, not Germany, would hold the balance of power. The aircraft carrier was more than steel. It was a symbol. It represented mobility, reach, and control. It carried the promise that America could project its power to any corner of the globe. To the Germans, who had once believed Europe was the center of the world, it was a bitter lesson. The center was shifting, and it was shifting west. As they were marched along the pier, the Germans glanced back again and again, as though trying to burn the image into their minds. The carrier loomed behind them, massive and unyielding, its flag waving boldly in the wind. Some would later speak of this moment in whispers, long after the war. They would admit, quietly, that it was then they knew the fight was over. Not because of a lost battle, not because of a failed mission, but because they had seen the future with their own eyes. And it did not belong to them. The narrator draws the thought tighter. Imagine it men who had once been the terror of seas and skies, now reduced to silence, their pride swallowed by the shadow of an American warship. They had entered the dockyard as officers of the Reich. They left as broken men, their illusions stripped away. The carrier did not fire a shot that day. It did not need to. Its presence alone was a weapon of awe, of fear, of inevitability. And in the quiet march back to their quarters, the Germans carried with them a truth they could never shake. America had already won.